That was step one. Not a lot went on, but let's get some more going. So now this first, once we've got everything going, the first part of the actual authentication flow is figuring out if we already are authenticated. So is this user authenticated is the first question we have to ask. Basically, we're gonna take the case where we don't have access tokens for the user to be the case where the user is not authenticated. So we need to get those tokens. If we don't have them, then we're going to go into the authorization flow or authentication. So the flow will be kind of like this in another simple sequence diagram here. The status list activity will start out and ask the application, which will kind of be the way that will generalize and keep above all the activity level these kind of questions. We'll ask the application, are you authorized? And then the application will pass off that question to this OAuth helper, which will deal with all that kind of stuff. And the application will know to ask if we have tokens yet. And if we don't have tokens, the OAuth helper will say, no, we don't have tokens. And the application will say, no, we're not authorized to the status list activity. And in that case, the status list activity will spawn a new activity using an intent, and that will be the authorization activity. So we'll start that activity and put the user into the authorization flow. And so basically, once again, if we don't have those tokens, and we're going to show the Twitter authorization page and have the user sign in. So basically, that's what we're going to do through these steps. So let me open up part 2 here, step 2. And let's take a look at how we ask those questions and kind of dive into the application this way. You can see that there's a few more packages created here, but I'll go through as the code is going through the flow to introduce those new activities. So I'm going to start with the status list activity, which we already looked at, which was very basic. But you can see now that we've added one or two more things. Now, once we're created, we're getting a reference to our particular application. And just in case anybody forgot, because this is always a pain when you forget to do this, let me look at the manifest. And inside the manifest, in this application tag, which is where we describe the application for Android, you can see that I have this new attribute here, Android:name, which points to the relative class name from the base package name. So com.o'reilly.android.otweet.otweet application is the path to the application that we want Android to instantiate as our application class. So that is how that application comes to be the one that we want to use. So we're going to get a reference to that here in the onCreate inside the status list activity. Okay, so that's onCreate. That means that's the first time this activity is run. What we're going to do is get a reference to that application. On resume, so every time this activity comes to the forefront, every time this activity becomes the activity that the user is looking at, which includes the first time after onCreate is run, we want to check to see if we're authorized, because if we're not, if anything happened throughout any other flow in the application, we need to log the user back in. We can't let them do anything else. So we're going to check this every time that this activity resumes. So we're going to pass that question off to the application again. So what I'm going to do is put my pointer on this on line 25 and hit F3 in Eclipse, which will jump to that method. And now you can see the otweet application that we've set up here. The otweet application is pretty simple at this point. There's an onCreate, which is called the first time the application is created. And we take that opportunity to get a reference to the OAuth helper, which we're going to look at in just a second. And then the isAuthorized method will give us a Boolean, which basically delegates off to the OAuth helper and asks whether we have an access token yet. So let me hit F3 on this method, and we'll jump into that OAuth helper. And again, this isn't any special class. It's just something I've created to delegate off dealing with OAuth keys and whatnot. So there's a couple things that I'm going to keep reference to as the OAuth helper is alive. I'm going to keep the consumer secret key and the consumer key around in memory, and then I'm also going to have a context because I'll need to do some things with a context. Remember, a context is both the application of an Android application and any of the activities are all contexts, and we need to sometimes do some things that take a context. So I'm going to keep around the reference, and you can see when I constructed this, I passed in the application, so that's going to be our context. So we keep the context around the first time this OAuth helper is created on line 16 here. And then on line 18, I'm going to go load consumer keys, because we can't do anything with Twitter until we tell Twitter what our consumer keys are, so it knows that we've signed up as an application. So we jump into that method here down on line 25. Basically, this is some kind of boilerplate code that you would use to load any .properties files that you wanted to out of the raw resources of Android, of your Android application. So you can, off of a context, you can say get resources, open a raw resource. So this is how you would get access to any resource that you packaged along with your application in the raw directory. And then that will give you an input stream, and then it's pretty simple to load a properties kind of hash off of a input stream, and then we'll just grab the consumer key and consumer secret key off of that input stream, and then we'll have access to those guys as we need to use them throughout the application. But if you remember line 21, line 23, this is the application, or this is where the application calls to see if we have the access token. And for right now, we're just going to hardwire it to false, because we don't have the application saving those keys, and in fact, we're not even getting them yet. So basically, every time right now, we're going to say that the user is not logged in because the application is going to find we don't have an access token, and so it's going to return false from is authorized, and then status list will get a false right here, and so it will go into this begin authorization flow, which is just down here on line 32, and it starts a new intent and starts that activity, which will open up the authorization activity class. So let's give that a look. I'll hit F3 here. And authorization activity is pretty simple. On create, we get a reference to the application, just like we did in the other activity. We set the content view to the authorization view, and then we set up, pass off the setup of the views, where we just basically grab a reference to that web view. But we're not doing anything with that yet. So let's look at the layout. So if we hit Command Shift on the Mac, or I think Control Shift on Windows, you can open up this open resource view, and then say authorization view, and I'll open that up off of week 1, step 2, and you can see that's pretty simple. We just have a web view component here, and that's basically a WebKit web view control component. It doesn't have like a back button or an URL toolbar or anything like that. It's just enough to view any web page, and it's pretty simple to just dump that into your application in that state, and that's what it looks like in code when you set up a web view. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Hopefully that makes sense. All we're doing is deciding whether or not we're authorized. We've hardwired that to return false, so every time that the application is open, it should jump over to the authorization activity and display a blank web view right now. So let's run that to see how it looks. Running step 2. I switch over to the emulator, and as it starts up, the status list activity decides that we're not logged in, so you can see that it kicks over to the authorization. It shows the authorization title here instead of the status list activity title, and then there's a web view that doesn't have any web page to view. So it's blank, and it sits right here. So that's everything that we needed to accomplish in step 2. So let's see if there's any questions about what we did so far there.
I do have a couple of questions. One person asks, is the application file generated by the SDK based on the manifest, or was that something you created?
That's something I created. So
okay.
All you need to do is, so I decided to put it right at the base of the package. Just make a new class, and you need to extend application, which is, if I twirl down this list of imports, is an android.app.application. And then to get that to be the application that's loaded instead of the standard Android application inside the manifest, you need to go make the change yourself to set this what do you call it, attribute Android.name to the name of your application inside the application tag.
Got it. And then I know you covered this in your first part of the class, but can you remind everybody of sort of the relationship between the application and the activities? Do all the activities have visibility to the application?
Yep. Any activity can call this get application method. That's a method on, I think it's either activity or a superclass of that, and that will return the Android application. So if we cast it into ours, we can make sure that we let the code know that we're going to be using the application that we created, and that application is running the whole time that our application is running. It's like synonymous. It's one-to-one relationship. Your activities may or may not be running at any point. They could be moved into different states, but all of them can get access to that application. So that's a great place to put general sort of application-wide code.
Got it. I think that's it from me. Ruth has a question.
Okay. Somebody asked here, there's a lot of questions regarding what's the min and max SDK versions that we should be using for Android. So can you just confirm that verbally again for everyone asking this? And then there's a lot of questions regarding the raw resource and where that's located and how that's created. I think some people missed that.
Okay. So the min and max, I'm just using 2.1. I was using the most recent version available. With this equates to 2.1. 7 is 2.1. So that's when I set up my Android application from scratch, that's the one I picked. I think we ran into this in the as a question in the overview. Somebody wondered if any of the code was dependent on 2.1, and actually, yes, down in the last here, if I open up the Package Explorer, down here in step 2 of week 5, I'm actually that's when I first start relying on 2.1. So and that was to deal with some thumbnailing stuff, creating thumbnails from images. So we're not really relying on 2.1. I just figured there's no reason not to make it 2.1, because at least anybody who's following along with this code can get access to 2.1 as far as the emulator goes. So it shouldn't be too hard to set everything up that way. And then for creating raw resources, you need to do this by hand. You just need to go into the resources directory, create a new directory called raw, create a new file called oauth.properties, and inside, I got to look at step 1 here because I have my actual keys in step 2. And then inside oauth.properties, make a key called consumer key and a key called consumer secret key, and then put the values from your applications page on Twitter into here. In summary, the application will treat the auth tokens as evidence that the user is logged in. So that's what we're going to use to decide whether or not we're logged in or not.